Deep in the backwoods of North Carolina, the year was 1858, and the small town of Willow Marsh clung tightly to its faith. At the center of the community stood a modest chapel, its wooden beams weathered by years of southern storms, its pews carved by the hands of the very families who filled them each Sunday. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a humble country church. But to those who lived there, it would soon become something else entirely, a place of fear, and of silence broken only by voices that were not supposed to exist. In the year 1858, North Carolina was a place caught between the old ways of the South and the creeping changes of a restless nation. Towns and villages remained scattered and self-reliant, their people bound to the land, their survival tied to the slow rhythm of seasons. In the backwoods, where cypress trees leaned heavy over murky waters and fields stretched beyond the horizon, faith was often the only structure holding communities together. It was not a faith of grandeur, nor the gold-etched cathedrals of cities far away, but one of weathered chapels, wooden pews, and hymnals worn thin from countless hands. These churches were not just houses of worship. They were the lifeblood of small settlements, places where men, women, and children gathered not only to pray but to share news, mourn their dead, and remind one another that they were not as isolated as the wilderness around them might suggest. The air of rural North Carolina carried with it an unease, a silence broken only by the crack of an axe splitting wood or the distant sound of a crow. In such silence, people paid attention to details. Every creak of a floorboard, every unexplained whisper of wind through the trees. Superstition thrived in this soil, and for good reason. Death came easily in these parts. A fever could take a child before dawn. A snakebite might rob a man of his strength within hours, and an accident in the fields could leave a widow with nothing but unanswered prayers. It was in these harsh realities that belief in both the divine and the supernatural flourished. God was near, but so were restless spirits, and the line between them seemed thin. Life revolved around the chapel. Its simple bell tower, often the only structure rising above the tree line, was both beacon and sentinel. Farmers would glance toward it from their plows. Mothers would send their children along its dirt path every Sabbath morning, and its doors would creak open for weddings, funerals, and every small event in between. But with such importance placed upon the church came an undercurrent of dread. To falter in faith was to risk not only the scorn of neighbors, but also the wrath of something unseen. In an era when night was lit only by oil lamps and the sky's pale moon, shadows pressed close, and every sound carried meaning. Those who lived on the fringes of these settlements, far from the heart of the towns, often described the land itself as alive. The marshes gurgled as if they kept secrets. The wind through the trees mimicked voices when it struck the branches just so. Families huddled in cabins built of rough-hewn logs, and when the fires burned low, they listened to the night, uncertain of what they heard. Against this backdrop, the community of Willow Marsh, a place barely marked on a map, carved out its existence. For them, the chapel was not just a building. It was a shield. It held their weddings, christened their children, and laid their dead to rest in the soil behind its modest frame. Yet that same soil held more than they could bear to know, and in the fragile stillness of the late 1850s, it would soon begin to reveal itself through the most unexpected of messengers, hymns without voices. The chapel of Willow Marsh stood as if it had always been there, though in truth it was barely 20 years old. Built by the hands of local farmers and carpenters, it was simple in design, a wooden frame resting on stone foundations, its white paint long since dulled to gray by rain and sun. The bell tower leaned ever so slightly, its iron tongue ringing out each Sunday to summon the faithful from across the marshlands. Inside, the scent of pine boards lingered, mingling with the faint aroma of oil lamps that had burned low through countless evenings of prayer. The pews were uneven, some with initials carved into them by restless children, others polished smooth by years of use. There was no grandeur here, no stained glass to catch the morning light. Only windows of clear glass that allowed the rising sun to spill across the congregation in long, pale beams. Despite its modest size, the chapel commanded an undeniable presence. In a land where most homes were little more than one-room cabins and barns, its tall, narrow steeple was a mark of permanence. Travelers who passed through Willow Marsh would speak of its quiet beauty, how it seemed to watch over the settlement like a guardian. But to those who lived beneath its shadow, the church carried something more complex, comfort interlaced with unease. By day, it was a gathering place filled with the sound of boots on the wooden floor, the rustle of hymnals, and the steady cadence of Reverend Harker's sermons. By night, it became something else. Its darkened windows stared outward like empty eyes, and the silence surrounding it pressed heavily on those who dared to walk the road past its gates. Stories had long circulated among the townsfolk, whispered between neighbors after services or murmured to children who wouldn't keep still. Some claimed the land on which the chapel was built had once been cursed, for it belonged to a family who perished under strange circumstances years before, their homestead reduced to ash in a fire that no one could quite explain. Others spoke of strange noises heard during construction, the pounding of hammers echoing when no one worked, the sound of weeping carried from the rafters before the roof was ever finished. Most dismissed such tales as idle talk, yet even the most devout admitted that the chapel seemed different from the others in neighboring towns, touched by something unseen. As the years passed, the stories grew with the town itself. A farmer's daughter once claimed she heard footsteps following her in the sanctuary when she went to fetch a forgotten shawl after dusk, though no one was there when she turned. A young boy swore he saw lights flickering in the bell tower late at night, though the reverend denied ever setting foot there after sundown. These accounts were never spoken aloud in Sunday gatherings, for to question the holiness of the chapel was to risk ridicule. Still, people remembered them, tucked away like unspoken warnings. The reputation of the church began to form quietly, like mist rolling in from the marshes. It was a place of prayer, but also of stories that could not be explained. The children of Willow Marsh often dared each other to linger in its graveyard after dark, where crooked headstones leaned against the earth and owls cried from the trees. Adults walked the road past it with faster steps, especially when the wind carried across the marsh in hollow tones that sounded unnervingly like voices. The chapel was not just a house of God. It was a vessel of memory, rumor, and shadow. And when the first reports of unearthly hymns rose within its walls, no one could quite claim they were surprised. It was in early October when the first true incident took place, the one that marked the beginning of the whispers. Elias Crowder, a farmer in his 40s with hands hardened by years of tilling soil, had spent the day mending a broken fence line. The sun had dipped behind the trees before he and his wife Martha finished, and by the time they made their way back along the dirt path that passed near the chapel, the air had grown cool and heavy. The marshes hummed with insects, and the faint glow of lantern light spilled from the windows of their cabin in the distance. Yet it was not the familiar sounds of night that stopped them in their tracks. From the direction of the chapel, rising faintly above the drone of crickets, came the sound of music. At first, Elias thought it must be some lingering rehearsal, though he knew well enough that the choir had not gathered that evening. It was not a single voice, nor even two, but many, layered harmonies carrying a hymn both mournful and strangely sweet. Martha gripped his arm, her breath catching as the melody swelled, drifting across the open field as though the very air had become a vessel for song. Lantern in hand, Elias decided to investigate. Each step closer seemed to draw the voices sharper, clearer, until the words themselves could be made out. Lines of a familiar psalm, sung with perfect unity, rising and falling in rhythms too precise to be mistaken for wind or imagination. When they reached the chapel doors, the sound was almost overwhelming, yet the building stood in darkness. With a trembling hand, Elias pushed the door open, and together they stepped inside. The hymn continued for a moment, echoing from the rafters, and then silence. The pews were empty. The pulpit stood as it always had, draped in its plain cloth. The air was colder than it should have been, as though the warmth of bodies had been drawn out of the space. Elias raised his lantern high, sweeping its dim glow across the walls, half expecting to see figures retreating into the shadows. But there was nothing, only the faint smell of damp wood and candle wax burned long ago. Martha later swore that she could still feel the vibrations of the music beneath her feet, as if the hymn had been carried through the very floorboards. Elias, though a man of few words and little imagination, admitted he had never heard anything so vivid, nor felt so certain that unseen eyes were watching. They left quickly, closing the heavy door behind them, the silence outside somehow deeper than before. By the time they reached their cabin, neither spoke of what they had witnessed. Yet within days, the story began to spread, carried from neighbor to neighbor in hushed tones. Children overheard and repeated it, adding their own flourishes. until the tale of the ghostly hymn was known across Willow Marsh. Some dismissed it outright, saying Elias must have mistaken the wind or been half asleep. But those who knew him, practical, sober, never one to chase fancy, found themselves unsettled, and Martha's quiet insistence that the hymn had been as real as her own heartbeat made it harder to laugh away. It was only the beginning, yet already the foundation of certainty in the town had begun to tremble. As October deepened into November, the strange occurrence reported by Elias and Martha Crowder no longer stood alone. Others began to tell of similar experiences, and what had first been dismissed as rumor grew into a pattern that could not be ignored. The next account came from a group of children, no older than 10 or 11, who had dared each other to approach the chapel after dusk. Armed with nothing more than a stolen lantern and nervous laughter, they crept along the fence line of the graveyard. The church loomed before them, its windows black, its steeple leaning against the pale glow of the moon. At first there was only silence, so heavy it seemed to press on their ears. Then, without warning, voices rose from within the chapel, clear and strong, filling the night air with song. The children froze, their courage fleeing as the melody swelled into perfect harmony. They swore later that the sound was too powerful, too full, to come from such a small building. Terrified, they dropped the lantern and fled. One of them so shaken, he swore he saw figures moving behind the glass. The story spread quickly, and it was not long before others added their voices to the growing chorus of testimonies. A widow by the name of Clara Bell recounted how, while hanging laundry one evening at the edge of her property, she heard a hymn carried on the breeze. She was used to the songs of worship. She had sung them all her life, but this was different. The harmony was richer, deeper, as though the voices belonged to a multitude. Her heart stopped when she claimed she recognized one of the voices, a low baritone that had once filled the pews of the chapel. It was her late husband's, dead and buried for 2 winters. Clara swore she fell to her knees right there in the dirt, unable to breathe, convinced that the choir she heard was not of the living. Each new account added fuel to the fire of speculation. Some in Willow Marsh convinced themselves it was a divine sign, a blessing, the angels themselves lending their voices to strengthen the faith of a struggling community. Others whispered darker things. They recalled the rumors of the land's past, the burned homestead that had once stood where the chapel now rose, the family who vanished without trace, the unexplained misfortunes that seemed to linger in the soil. A few muttered that what the townsfolk heard were not angels, but the damned, their voices chained to earth, crying out in hymns because no one had ever laid them to rest. Fear spread quietly at first, then more openly. Families who once stayed late in the fields began to hurry home before dusk. Children were warned not to linger near the chapel at night. Even the most devout admitted a certain chill crept over them whenever the sun dipped low and the building loomed in shadow. The once ordinary road past the church grew avoided, travelers taking longer routes rather than passing by its silent doors. And though the hymns never came at predictable times, every ear in Willow Marsh seemed to strain for them when the night grew still, waiting, dreading, and half hoping to hear that impossible harmony rise once more from the empty chapel. By the onset of winter, Willow Marsh was a town divided. The stories of the hymns had spread too widely to ignore, and the once tight community found itself pulled in different directions. On Sundays, the pews still filled with families, but the air was no longer one of quiet devotion. Conversations buzzed before the service, whispers traded in cautious tones. Some parishioners entered the chapel with eyes lifted, hopeful, expecting a sign from heaven itself. Others came reluctantly, their faces drawn, as though merely stepping into the building might invite something dark upon them. Even within families, belief and doubt tore at the seams. Children listening wide-eyed to ghost tales while their parents argued whether such talk was blasphemy. Those who believed the voices were divine clung fiercely to the notion. They said God had chosen Willow Marsh, that his angels had descended in song to strengthen a people battered by hardship. Reverend Josiah Harker, though visibly shaken by his own private experiences, leaned toward this interpretation in his sermons. He spoke of heavenly hosts, of blessings hidden in mystery, and of the duty to receive such wonders with humility. To the faithful who wished for hope, his words were a balm. They left the chapel convinced they had been touched by something holy, even if their own ears had never heard the unearthly choir. Yet others resisted. The more the story spread, the more suspicion took root. Some recalled the long-forgotten tragedies of the land, the vanished family whose charred homestead had given way to the chapel, the accounts of misfortune and unexplained deaths that clung to the soil. For them, the hymns were not blessings but warnings. They argued the voices were the cries of the restless dead, found beneath the floorboards of the church, denied peace. To those who had lost loved ones, this explanation was more terrifying still. If the departed could not rest, what did that mean for their own kin buried in the churchyard? What did it mean for their own salvation? The tension seeped into daily life. Neighbors who once shared meals now avoided one another, mistrust growing between those who called the hymns angelic and those who whispered of curses. Children repeated fragments of both tales, their imaginations blurring the lines until fear became its own contagion. Some began to claim they had heard their own dead among the voices, a mother recognizing a child, a brother hearing his sibling. Whether born of truth or suggestion, these confessions spread panic like wildfire. The divisions turned inward, even within the Reverend himself. Though he urged his congregation to see the voices as divine, those closest to him noticed his hands trembled more than they once did, his eyes lingering too long on the dark corners of the chapel. Rumor swelled that he had confessed, quietly and in confidence, that one night while kneeling alone in prayer, he had heard words among the hymns, pleading, mournful words that no angel would utter. Whether true or not, the story cemented fear among the doubters. By late December, Willow Marsh was a town that no longer trusted itself. Faith had fractured, suspicion festered, and the once simple chapel stood at the center of a storm that grew darker with each passing night. The hymns, whether angelic or damned, had become more than sound. They were a mirror held to the town's soul, reflecting both devotion and dread, and widening the cracks between them with every echo from the empty pews. The revelation began in the most ordinary of ways, with a loose floorboard. It was late January when the winter rain seeped through the roof of the chapel, dripping steadily onto the pulpit until the boards beneath softened and began to warp. A pair of local carpenters, Samuel Pike and Thomas Weller, were called to repair it. They arrived early, carrying tools and lanterns, the air outside still gray with dawn. At first, the work was routine. Nails driven back into place, beams checked for rot. But when Samuel pressed against a section of floor just beneath the pulpit, the wood shifted oddly beneath his weight. A hollow sound echoed up from below, one that should not have existed in a chapel with no cellar. Curious, he pried the board loose, expecting perhaps an old storage space or a nest of vermin. What he uncovered instead chilled both men to the bone. Beneath the pulpit lay a shallow cavity, its walls lined crudely with earth, and within it the unmistakable shape of bones. The lantern light revealed fragments of skulls, ribs collapsed into dust, and scraps of fabric still clinging to them as though time itself had been reluctant to consume the remains. The smell was faint but unmistakable, stale, earthy, tinged with the sourness of something once human. Samuel dropped his hammer and staggered back, while Thomas muttered a prayer under his breath, his voice shaking. They pulled back more boards, and the horror deepened. Not one body, but several, layered together, as if buried in haste, hidden away where no congregation was ever meant to find them. News spread quickly. By midday, half the town had gathered around the chapel, their faces pale with dread, their voices low and urgent. Reverend Harker himself stood over the open cavity, his expression caught between disbelief and despair. He knelt and touched a fragment of cloth, then withdrew his hand as though burned. "Not strangers," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Those words carried through the crowd like a curse. Not strangers, meaning the dead were their own, parishioners who had once filled the very pews upon which they now stood. Families pressed forward, whispering names, recalling those who had vanished in years past. There had been talk, of course. Families who left without word, men who never returned from the fields, women who seemed to fade from memory. But no one had asked too deeply. In small towns, disappearances were often folded into rumor, attributed to misfortune, migration, or God's mysterious will. Now, faced with the truth lying beneath the pulpit, the explanations unraveled. Speculation grew wild. Had these been victims of some long-forgotten crime, buried in secrecy by hands they once trusted? Or were they tied to the darker whispers surrounding the land itself, the burned homestead and its vanished family? Some suggested that the Reverend must have known, though his stricken face denied it. Others suspected those who had built the chapel, saying they had covered up an atrocity and left the living to worship above the dead. The unearthed bones gave the hymns a terrifying clarity. No longer could they be dismissed as wind or imagination. No longer could they be embraced as blessings. The voices were tethered to these remains, a choir of the forgotten, calling upward through the floorboards for justice, or for peace that had been denied to them. From that day on, no one entered the chapel without feeling the weight of those hidden dead pressing upon their prayers. The hymns, once mysterious, became unbearable, for now each note seemed sharpened with accusation. Families who had lost loved ones stood outside in silence, listening, wondering if the voices of their kin were among those phantom harmonies. The discovery did not solve the mystery of the silent choir. It deepened it, binding the town to the uneasy knowledge that their faith had rested for years upon a grave they had never acknowledged. After the discovery beneath the pulpit, Willow Marsh was never the same. What had once been a humble chapel at the heart of the community now stood as a place of dread, its walls steeped in suspicion and grief. The congregation tried at first to continue as before. They held services, sang hymns with trembling voices, and forced themselves to sit upon the pews above the place where the bones had been found. But it was no use. Every creak of the wooden floor, every hollow echo beneath their feet reminded them of the dead, of the secrets buried within the very structure they had called sacred. Some claimed that the hymns grew louder after the bones were disturbed. They said the voices carried with more force, as though angered by exposure, demanding recognition rather than secrecy. Others swore the singing had stopped entirely, silenced once the remains were removed, as if the spirits had been released from their captivity. The division between these accounts only deepened the unease, for no one could say for certain what was true. Fear began to outweigh faith, and within months the pews were emptier, the chapel quieter, until at last the doors were closed altogether. Abandonment came slowly, then all at once. Families who had long relied on the church for every milestone of life, christenings, marriages, burials, began seeking such rites in neighboring towns, preferring the long, weary journeys to the risk of worshiping in Willow Marsh. The graveyard behind the chapel grew neglected, its headstones leaning and sinking into the soil. Children, once dared to creep near the chapel doors, now refused to pass it even in daylight. The steeple, once a proud landmark rising above the trees, became a reminder of something best forgotten. Yet forgetting was impossible. The legend of the silent choir took root as firmly as the cypress trees that lined the marshes. Travelers passing through heard whispers of it at taverns, and over the years the tale spread beyond the town's borders. Some spoke of it as a warning, a cautionary story of secrets buried and the voices that refused to remain silent. Others told it as a ghost story, dressing it in exaggerations, claiming that entire hymns could still be heard on still nights, the words clear enough to chill the blood. For the people of Willow Marsh, however, the legend was no tale but a wound. Old men remembered the first whispers of song carried on the autumn air. Widows wept at the thought of hearing the voices of their dead loved ones. And though the chapel doors rotted on their hinges, no one dared tear the building down. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps a kind of respect, a recognition that what lay there was not to be disturbed further. The building became a husk, its windows broken, its bell long rusted silent, yet it endured, standing as a reminder that some places are not easily reclaimed by time. Even generations later, when most of the names from that era had faded into dust, the story endured. Hunters claimed to hear faint harmonies drifting through the trees. Farmers swore the marsh carried voices at night when the fog rolled thick. And every so often, someone would insist they heard their own name carried in the hymn, as if the choir was still searching, still calling for another to join them. The silent choir became more than a haunting. It became a legacy, one that tied the town forever to the uneasy truth that faith and fear often share the same walls, and that the dead, when forgotten, will find their own way to speak. As the echoes of the silent choir fade into the dark, we are left with more than just a tale of hymns without voices. We are left with questions that will not rest. Were these the cries of souls wronged and forgotten, or the shadows of grief carried by a town already burdened with fear? And if the dead truly sang beneath those floorboards, what does it say about the secrets our own towns, our own histories, may still be holding in silence? Stories like this are never meant to stay buried. They demand to be remembered, retold, and examined under the cold light of truth. That is why we bring them here to you, each account another piece of history's darker ledger, another whisper from the past refusing to be silenced. If this story has left you unsettled, if you find yourself wondering what it means for the living to pray above the dead, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the voices were of heaven, or of something far less merciful? Your reflections keep these stories alive, and your voice adds to the ongoing search for understanding. And if you wish to journey further into the forgotten corners of time, where mystery and crime intertwine with legend, make sure to subscribe. Each new story carries another door into the past, sometimes ajar, sometimes sealed with secrets, but always waiting to be opened. The question remains, when that door opens again, will you listen?